Mark Twain said once that history may not repeat, but it rhymes. And again, we're going to go up to 10,000 feet and take a look at the forest and see some rhymes over time. In many respects, I look at populism as a great tragedy because it begins to usher in the decline, the decay of the Southern agrarian identity to some degree. But first, let's have a humorous story about all this. David Goldfield, historian up in UNC Charlotte, told this story. He was a young graduate student at the time, and he had been invited by Avery Craven, who was mentoring him, and Avery, unbeknownst to David Goldfield at the time, married to Tom Watson's daughter. So he was asked, and by the way, for those of you not from the South, beware this trap, beware questions. He was asked, so what do you think of Tom Watson? And like many young graduate students, of which I'm guilty as well, the soapbox came out. He went up to the rostrum and he thundered his denunciations of how could this man who had worked for the reconciliation of the races become a rabid racist himself and a rabid anti-Catholic and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then somebody at the dinner table mentioned to him that, well, you know, Mrs. Craven is the daughter of Tom Watson. And so the trap had been closed. So, what did Mrs. Craven say to him? She said, father could be difficult. And indeed, you know, there's a lot of wisdom in that about the populist movement overall. So what was populism? Frederick Jackson Turner said it this way: taken as a whole, populism is a manifestation of the old pioneer ideals, with the added element of increasing readiness to utilize the national government to effect ends. Richard Hofstadter took a different view, as you might imagine. He had said that no, populists had good ideas and they were sincere, but you really needed the progressive reformers to carry those ideas. You needed the elite to work on this thing to get this done. And then harumph, harumph, harumph. Contemporary historians have taken all kinds of different tacks. Very good book by Omar Ali in The Lion's Mouth takes a look at the Colored Farmers Alliance, and it's a worthwhile book. It's not wonderful, but it gives an idea that, yeah, there was a very strong movement of folks, African Americans in the South, who were farmers in the alliance movement, who were very clever in making alliances with the white farmers' alliances, were very popular in politics for a time in certain areas, particularly eastern North Carolina, what have you. And you have other studies like this, state studies that abound in this type of thing. Lawrence Goodwin, of course, writes a typical study, The Democratic Promise of the Populists. He likes the populists in one respect, that they are introducing more democracy into the American polis. Of course, you have C. Van Woodward's Tom Watson, Agrarian Rebel, which we've already looked at in the story from Goldfield, right? You know, what happened to poor Tommy Watson. And then Charles Postel, The Populist Vision. In all of these things, we see the folks decrying that the populists never forged a lasting alliance with American industrial labor. We also see folks decrying the fact that, you know, they never really made it as a third party, and that might have been a good thing. They didn't alleviate racial tensions in the South or animosities between the classes in the South. And basically, the biggest crying that goes on is, we just really wish the Redeemers were right and that the populists really were socialists, because Lord knows we really wanted them to be socialists and it just didn't work out for us. And that's often a dominant theme in the Academy's view of all this. In my view, as usual, Frederick Turner's closest to the mark on this. He's probably closest to the mark. So let's go take a look at the forest. I'm not interested in the populists becoming like a labor party. I'm not really particularly interested whether they're socialist or not. For me, one of the dominant themes in American political history is the theme of court versus country. And it's not because it's a nice little template we can just put on there. It's because this is a historical reality that's emerging in that crisis of the 1600s and continues on. And it morphs, it changes, but it still is a very important underlying theme. If you look at a map of blue and red, we see that theme playing out to this very day in some fashion. So let's go back to court versus country. As we emerge in the 1700s, Parliament wins the supremacy game, right? The Act of Settlement, the Glorious Revolution, they're calling the shots. The Stuarts make an attempt at a good comeback for the English throne, but they get thrown back in 15. And in 45, believe it or not, Stuart was right. They really should have gone to London. Bonnie Prince Charlie had it right. But the reality was they lose there as well. But here's a problem. So when you go casting about looking for, okay, who do we put on the throne now? They come up with the House of Hanover. And they don't speak English. And they're not really have a solid reputation for being particularly bright either. So the prime minister of the time, Walpole, has a problem. I have got to win allegiance to this group because we still have all these crypto Jacobites running around England, Scotland, and Ireland. How do I do that? I will corrupt the parliament. I will make sure our agenda gets through and loyalty is won to the Hanoverians by giving people offices and bounties, subsidies. I will buy votes. Not everybody was in favor of this. And this group known as the Country Party, which is mostly country Tories at first and later morphs into a country Whig alliance, they ultimately are the ones that are like, oh no, corruption. How do we deal with this? How do we fight this corruption when the government can dispense favors and whatnot? And we're suddenly beginning to see the court is a problem. Consolidated government is a problem because of the resources it can capture to influence policy, but also to corrupt the morals of people who need to be disinterested. So, Lord Bolingbroke, I'll just use him as an example. He comes up with an interesting theory. We need to get the country in power in Parliament because the men of the landed estates are self-sufficient. They don't need subsidies. They don't need to be the absentee landowner of some sugar plantation down in Barbados. They are already situated in place. They're dedicated to place. They are the disinterested group. Hence, the emergence of the country Tory argument, the country party. They will be loyal to the Hanoverians because they happen to wear the crown at the moment, though it would be nice if the Jacobites did come back over. But nevertheless, we're the ones with virtue. And by virtue is meant manliness, strength of conviction, resistance to temptation. We're the guys you can count on. It didn't really capture a whole lot of traction. In fact, Walpole himself made this instance. He said, whenever we tax the landed class in England, they are like sheep who come to be sheared, and we shear them. But whenever we lay a finger upon the hair of the merchant class, the entire sty is in an uproar. So in a sense, the country party never coalesced into a powerful counterweight. But it does in America. Virginians, Marylanders, Carolinians begin to read these people, and they were saying, hey, these people that Bolingbroke and these other folks are talking about, they're us. We're self-sufficient, sort of. We are virtuous. We are the ones who pretty much control the affairs of these southern colonies. These people are us. Interestingly enough, this is generally your elite group. Now, yes and no. They weren't that self-sufficient, and we'll talk about why they weren't that self-sufficient, but they were certainly capable of a certain degree of self-sufficiency for the most part. The revolt in America is kind of interesting in the 1760s, and I think T.H. Breen did some good work. He upset the historical profession, and that's never a bad thing. Because all of these planters in the 1760s, as the credit markets are collapsing, and they can't get their bills of exchange accepted by the mercantile houses in England for their tobacco, are suddenly screaming, you are trying to enslave us. You are using credit and the denial of credit to enslave us. We know what you're up to, and we're going to resist this. Now, this is important. Again, this is predominantly elite people, large tobacco plantation folks, some rice and indigo thrown in there, what have you. But they're deeply worried about British fiscal policy at the time and what this is leading to. And they have this fear that economic enslavement will lead to political enslavement. Kind of rhymes a little bit with what's going on nowadays, doesn't it? When the revolution is won, and we're sorting out what kind of union the nation will be. We have, of course, the Jefferson Hamilton dichotomy that emerges. And here is, in my view, the fundamental conflict in American politics. Race is important in American politics. There are many things important in American politics. But for my money, this is the fundamental dichotomy. Are we going to allow for a consolidation of political and financial power in the national capital, or are we going to resist it? Hamilton was like, no, baby, we need that consolidation. We need to imitate England. We need a perpetual debt. We need a close alliance between the men of means and the government going forward. Because who knows what other war we may have to fight, right? He was already anticipating the neocons. We might have more wars, and we'll need more debt to fight those wars. But this is important. We have to win the men of means and have their loyalty in the government. And just an aside, go off script, as Dr. Kibler would say, it doesn't also hurt that you're trading those bonds on inside information, does it? Not at all. So there was money to be made here as well. There was money to be made here, and that's often forgotten by the champions of Mr. Hamilton. Well, Mr. Jefferson and others in Virginia who followed him more or less said, no, this is not a good thing. We understand how credit works. We understand debt. We should know. Many of us are up to our ears in debt. So because of that situation, we understand the kind of leverage that can be used against debtors. We also understand the kind of leverage that the creditors to the United States government, whether they're foreign or domestic, can use to influence policy. If we have any doubts about that, let's jump back to the late Middle Ages for just a second. The Fugger family. The Fugger family was an enterprising group of Germans. Are there any non-enterprising Germans? Perhaps a few in Bavaria. But nevertheless, they're an enterprising group of Germans who have mines, and they have woolen industries, and they get into banking. And they had this wonderful letter that they send to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who's got the whole Protestant thing going on, the whole Ottoman thing going on. The man's got more problems than you can imagine. And they basically tell him, by the way, you're late on your payments to us, and we are not happy about that. And indeed, if you do not start paying up, we will contact Cardinal Richelieu, we'll contact the French. Cardinal Richelieu not now on the scene yet, but he would have taken the money. We will contact the French, and we will go ahead and start lending them money and see how pleasant it is to fight them when they start buying Swiss mercenaries. They're very upfront with this. It's essentially blackmail. You all either abide by this or things will go bad. Well, what happens in this debate? In my belief, the Jeffersonians win the debate for a time. By 1848, there is no national bank, no national creditor in this particular case. The other thing that's going on, too, is that the tariff rates are beginning to come down. Internal improvements, they've been decided to be unconstitutional. And, of course, we've just won Texas, right? We've solidified Texas. The Gadsden Purchase will be following shortly. We got Arizona, California, New Mexico, all the rest of it. And the Whig Party is pulling their hair out over this. And suddenly there's a lot of soul-searching going on. What do we do? The vision of Henry Clay and others lays in dust and ruins around us. And curiously enough, what begins to happen in 1848 is the slave card comes out of the deck. Let's reap the whirlwind and see what happens. Let's lay down that slave card. And it was actually wise in this respect, because you could have a sectional northern-based party and win the presidency and win the Senate eventually and definitely win the House. So yeah, why not go with the whirlwind? Why not move the debate in this direction? So that slave card is played. There still needs to be good studies on the 1850s. If you want to infuriate an American historian who will tell you slavery is the foundation of the war, at least the expansion of slavery, ask him to check out the 1860 census on Kansas and see how many slaves were in Kansas. Nobody wanted to take slaves in Kansas, violence or no violence. Shoot, nobody wants to live in Kansas. Some of those counties are below the population census for 1890. They're technically frontier counties again. But nevertheless, it was a mean, vicious war. And I'll say this, let's give a word out to Stephen Douglas. He had it right on popular sovereignty in this respect, because don't worry about it. Southerners are not moving into Kansas and Nebraska. If you all up north can keep your mouth quiet, you'll get what you want. If you just make this concession to Southerners and say, okay, whatever, we'll do the popular sovereignty thing, we'll see how the vote goes, then that's really going to be okay. But Southerners also saw this as a sign of perfidy on the part of the North, that they were going to be excluded not pragmatically because of population shifts, they were going to be excluded explicitly from those territories. And that made things very unpleasant through the 1850s. And then the gentleman who probably could have worked some stuff out died, unfortunately, by 1850. And of course, I'm referring to Calhoun, Clay, Webster, and others. Lesser men began to take their place at this time. And so what happens in the war? Well, we all know how that turned out. But there was a funny thing that happened on the way to the Consolidation nirvana. Mr. Lincoln, you ever read Mr. Lincoln on Banks towards the end of the war? He's very upset. He's had to go into a lot of debt. It takes a lot of money to kill Southerners, and you got to find people willing to lend you that money. And he's beginning to complain about the rising, threatening financial order on Wall Street that is beginning to affect American policy. Right? That's about the only time I've ever said a good thing about Mr. Lincoln. But nevertheless, he's concerned. He's deeply concerned. But he has set the engine forward. We have greenbacks, a fiat currency moving around, at least during the war years. The tariff is rising. All kinds of good time consolidations going on. And then other speakers have touched upon Reconstruction, political and economic, especially Mr. Lee, that solidifies this idea of the dangers of consolidated government at the end of a war. So this is the tale we're in. You can look at the war between the states as an attempt by the country party, more or less, to end and to get away from this consolidation of government, this consolidation of financial power with government. And we can go into all kinds of details about tariff rates, about the financing of cotton land and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, it's an unsuccessful movement. And now, when we get to the populists, they have to deal with a consolidated political and financial order, well established. And again, as I said the other day, they're not going to do the long war strategy. We're not going to see arms taken up again. These are not the descendants of the Visigoths in Spain, who are like, okay, we got 7 centuries, let's have at it. We're Americans, we think in decades. We're pragmatic in this case. So it'll be kind of interesting to see what these folks actually do. So in the post-war world, we give up the long war and we choose redemption. We'll get home rule back. And we hopefully can unite with certain conservative elements that will allow for that home rule to exist in the South at the time. So what led to the populist movement? Why did the farmers get upset? And by the way, what's kind of interesting about this in the long history of farmers getting upset, it upsets the court. I've referred to the regulator movement in North Carolina and South Carolina. Angry farmers taking the law into their own hands, going after marauders because the central government won't do it. How does the central government say, yes, we'll have an alliance. We'll send some sheriffs out. We'll get some posses formed. No, we're sending troops out and putting you people down. So in America, there's this dichotomy of the fear of the countryside to some degree. Sort of like the Great Fear in the French Revolution, I suppose. So the material conditions. Let's go out west first. Y'all ever read Little House on the Prairie, the stories? It's actually not bad history. Remember when Pa, Ma, and the Ingalls clan rolls up to the Dakotas? Everybody's moving into the Dakotas in the 1880s because it's raining. They didn't realize that it generally doesn't do that in the Dakotas, but it was raining now, and it was raining pretty good. And as the Dakotas and Nebraska are being settled, they're being settled in relatively wet years. Relatively wet means they're probably getting somewhere over 25 inches annually. Like in Nebraska, typical for them is 18. Can you imagine living in a place that's only 18 inches? That's almost a desert. In any event, they move out there, and then some nasty things begin to happen to these grain farmers. They begin to get drought towards the end of the 1880s, and it's a nasty drought. The skies just close up. Secondly, something that they experienced in the 1850s that set these northern farmers off, international competition. Eastern Europe and Australia are coming on to the wheat markets, and the price of wheat is going down. There's also deflation in the United States driving the price of wheat down. And credit is drying up. Financiers do not want to lend to these farmers who are in this disadvantageous position. And the West is getting scared because of that. Before I move to the South, I want to say a word about farming. This is the part that will glaze some eyes over. I mean, money's kind of funny and credit's kind of funny. It's crucial, it's important, it's what the Congress always argues about, and it's the thing that we never want to hear. So, get those toothpicks in there, and we'll get them opened up. The issue that we have with credit for farmers is a tough thing. First off, a farmer, you're in a perfect market. You're selling the whole crop. You can inventory very little of this stuff. Tobacco, a tiny bit. Cotton was very attractive because you could inventory it for a time. Hence, in the upcountry of South Carolina, they refer to their cotton crop as money in the bank because I could actually bank it. You can't bank much else. Try banking some tomatoes down in the cellar and see how that works out, right? You can't bank much else, so you've got to sell the whole thing. You can't hold off or really try to play with supply very much. You have the other problem that you are at the mercy of the good Lord. And indeed, that means droughts, insects, disease. There's any number of natural disasters that can wipe you down and wipe you out very quickly. The third problem is this. These farmers are going international. The grain markets were already international. The cotton market was international at this point. So cotton producers in the South will be competing with Egypt and India. That means, and the poor farmers don't realize this, it's not only problems of supply. You have currency risk, transportation risk. You have all kinds of speculation going on crops. And the poor farmers are well removed from this. They're way out yonder here. They're not picking up their copy of the Wall Street Journal online checking futures prices. The world that they're living in the South and the West is pretty much the world before the war. Because here's the last odd thing about agriculture. It's often the last to mechanize. It's often the last to adopt the procedures and methods of industrialization. It's just the way the thing works, and there's various reasons for this. So things are happening to these people, and they don't understand exactly why and how. Avery Craven has a great chapter on the 1850s where he calls the Northwest gets upset or something of this nature. And he talks about these Northwest farmers are getting hammered in the international grain markets, and they're absolutely convinced it's the South's fault. This is about slavery. It's like, no, son, it's about grain coming onto the market from Eastern Europe and depressing prices. But it's not because these farmers are unwise. It's they're very much removed from communication networks of the day. They just don't know the forces around them that are playing out. So let's go to the South. First and foremost, defeat in war. The capital is gone. The wealth is just gone. Fields have been burned. Tax increases. I had this professor at USC, God bless his heart. He was talking about, well, I understand that the rate of taxes went up triple digits, but if you actually look at it in dollar terms, it really wasn't much. And Carrie, you may have been in on that seminar, and I said, yeah, but Professor Blank, didn't they burn everything? I mean, at least the Southerners should have gotten like a depreciated value off of that property or something, It's just, there's a kind of naivety about what's going on. It's like, come on, man, just wake up. Sorry, my misspent youth. I still trade the markets, but I spent time at T. Rowe Price, and I'm still doing penance for those sins, But nevertheless, it always amazes me. Academics, particularly economists, don't have a clue about markets. You ask anybody who's ever traded a bond, and they'll say, oh gosh, those people are just hopeless. Well, you also have a devastating loss of life, and this is what is often not mentioned. Human capital, human resources, or let's just say, in the image of God, people are really important. Brain power is gone from the South because of those high casualty rates that so many states suffer, particularly the Carolinas. The Carolinas were brutalized in terms of the young people that they lost in that war. And whoever talks about the trauma suffered by the survivors. I believe Mississippi, after the war, in their budget, that artificial limbs was, if not the top item, near the top of the items. Think about the trauma of that, man. And like, oh, well, just pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Well, I don't have any because I lost my legs at Chattanooga. I mean, it's just kind of crazy that, they expect that. So what do? I mean, the South was in the position of having to completely redo its labor system under the strictures of the Freedmen's Bureau and under the close watch in the military occupation. That's kind of tough. We should go occupy Wall Street and have them do the same thing. In any event, the destruction of land, the labor system, capital, destruction of credit, and the increases of taxes on landed property were enormous millstones around the neck of Southerners. So what emerges, of course, is sharecropping and the crop lien system. We actually go back to the 1700s in many southern areas. Back in the 1700s in the backcountry of Virginia and the Carolinas, but especially Virginia, you had Scotsmen who opened up stores as supply merchants, and they were the ones who extended credit. This system goes throughout the entire South. So they put a lien on the crop for the payment of supplies and goods and things of this nature. Sharecropping between landowners and tenants often could be just, often it was not. Often contracts were not written down. Often there was a little cheating going on because in many cases these landowners are up against the wall as well. In some cases it could be just. In some cases contracts were very clear. Both sides shared in the losses. The integration into international commerce. I'll use an example here from Georgia. Steve Hahn wrote a wonderful book, The Roots of Southern Populism, and wonderful not because I agree with all of his conclusions, but I think he did good work. He looked at Piedmont counties in particular, two of them, but he did look at the Piedmont counties just south of Atlanta in this respect. And he said, interesting, before the war, those Piedmont counties account for about 10%, maybe a little less than that, of the cotton production of Georgia. After the war, it shoots up to 25%. Everybody's planting cotton because it's money in the bank. It's a cash crop. But it also means that as prices go down, what do farmers do with their cash crop? You plant more. You keep planting more. And cotton, you could hold off the market for a little bit. So it wasn't an irrational decision on their part. This was a pretty rational decision in this case. However, they're competing against international producers in cotton as well. And that's a tough thing. The effects. Well, Southern farmers are reliant on credit facilities for their seed, their equipment, sometimes for their necessities. They're exposed to national and international markets. And then there's the railroads. They have a dependence on the railroads to ship the crop. And I had all these statistics, but Mr. Lee, you've already done the job, and the rate discriminations were atrocious, absolutely atrocious. And railroads began to wield greater and greater power, not just with the federal government, but with the state governments in the South as well. Many New South advocates said, we have to have railroads to catch up. We'll cut the deals that we have to cut with these people in order to get that thing going. So both the West and the South experienced the effects of political and economic consolidation, and they're not good. Now here's the fun part. If you really want to scare New England, it's an alliance of the South and the West. Anytime the South and the West get together, people get scared. 1980 was a fun year with Reagan. Reagan was marketed as the wild man from the West. He's got these huge crowds in the South. Jimmy Carter just can't get any more traction and whatnot. And oh, lo and behold, the folks up north were just, it's happening again. It's Jackson or something like that. We can't have that. Before you know it, there'll be pitchforks in Boston. So bear that in mind, that there are going to be some people that are going to get really nervous about Southern and Western farmers and very nervous about white farmers and African-American farmers having some conversations on, wow, we had the dirty end of the stick, and what are we going to do about this? So there's going to be some real fear in both the worlds of finance and politics over this kind of thing. So who were the Southern populists? If you were a Southern populist, what were the characteristics? Well, almost all of them are rural people. This is a country party no matter how you slice it. They're almost all rural people, or like Tom Watson, they have significant ties to the land. They may be publishers and editors or lawyers, but they probably have some sort of farming interest as well. Their direct daily exposure to the new industrial world emerging is limited. It's pretty much the railroad and the telegraph. They don't really come into face-to-face contact very often with steel mills and iron mills and things of this nature. Their direct daily exposure to credit's their local banker, but more often, the supply merchant or the country store. In other words, again, they're living in a world that has changed, but their day-to-day world hasn't changed. They're still kind of doing business the way that business was often done in the South for a very long time. The rural church is the focus of their community. It's the meeting place not just for services, but for the local farmer alliances, for the granges in the Midwest that will make their way south. Many of these churches are deeply conservative. They're still served, many of them, by itinerant preachers. The country store and the courthouse were somewhat less important places, but the church is where you met for matters temporal and spiritual. And these communities are generally homogeneous in many respects. Even African American farmers and white farmers have a lot more between them that's similar than that's different in the way that they're approaching the world and the problems that they face. And your relationships are predominantly personal. They're face-to-face, unlike Facebook or MySpace. I used to combine them and call them MyFace, right? But now they were personal, and business was often done on a handshake, right? That's not how business is being done in the late 19th century up in New York. You got lawyers doing that business, man. You got contracts being written out and stuff. So there are some intrusions into this rural southern world that occur. And the first intrusion is, of course, Henry Grady's The New South. It's what I call the Scarlett O'Hara syndrome. The best revenge is to out-Yankee the Yankees, right? We're going to become like them. Oh, cheap labor? We'll use prison labor. Whatever it takes to industrialize, whatever it takes. Grady is very clear. We're going to beat you at iron production. We're going to beat you in steel production. We're going to beat you in railroad track laid. And this was being exposed to farmers in their, if they got a city daily, but more often in the county weekly, which would run some of these editorials that were coming out championing this New South. The other thing that they're finding more and more in the South is they really need to market the crop. I don't mean move it to market. They need to advertise it, to find buyers, to find a diversity of buyers, to get a bidding war for the crop going. So marketing facilities were really crucial for them. They need credit and money terribly, right? And what they're finding more and more is that their face-to-face world may exist, say, in Carroll County, Georgia, but they're having to deal with an impersonal world more and more to move the crop and to make money off of it. But there's other problems, the other intrusion. The other intrusion is, of course, deflation. The gold standard is king, the famous cross of gold of William Jennings Bryan. Crop prices are falling faster than the manufactured goods farmers are relying on. That's always a horrible trap, especially if you're relying on credit. Deflation is not good for people in debt because you're having to pay back your debt in money that's more highly valued than when you took the debt out. Your debtor wants some inflation so he can pay back with cheaper money. The farms in the South and the West were also undergoing a very slow, and I want to emphasize slow, mechanization trend, but they were. And it cost money. The Deere plow. You had grain drills, reapers, binders. Even in 1873, Kellogg puts out the first steam tractors. Now, mind you, I don't want to leave you with the impression that by 1890, everybody's up on their John Deere zipping down the field. No. But if you wanted to do the latest cutting-edge improved farming, you had to have capital to purchase this stuff. And if your neighbor had the capital, he's going to outproduce you. He's going to drive the price down. But for him, it doesn't matter. His gross receipts are going to cover his operation. Commercial agriculture, as I mentioned too, is a perfect market. You sell the whole crop at one price. Cotton gives you a little leeway, but there it is. And you have to find that buyer who can give you the most advantageous price. That's hard if you live in Carroll County, Georgia. That's a very difficult thing. Monetary policy, God bless them. The Coinage Act of 1873 ended bimetallism. The Treasury begins to stop the production of silver dollars. And what occurs with this is, of course, the Great Deflation. This is wonderful if you are a manufacturer. Great, I'm already well capitalized. My money's worth more. I'm going to be making all kinds of money because my per unit costs are going down. But if you're a debtor, you're getting crushed in these cases, absolutely crushed. And this happens just as farmers are increasing their debt load. This deflation occurs just as they're increasing their debt load to begin to catch up with this new industrial world. And I think the most important thing of all was this. God bless the economic historians. I've read a number of articles where they're talking about things really weren't so bad. Here's the production levels, this, that, and the other thing. But one person did a very good job of suggesting maybe that's true. However, if you're next door to a farmer and you've known that person and they may even be kin to you and they've just lost that farm and you think they're a pretty darn good farmer. I mean, you have farmed with them, they're honorable, they're upright, they know their business, but they lost the farm. That undermines your security. And insecurity begins to eat its way into the hearts and minds of Western and Southern farmers as they see neighbors who are good farmers unable to compete in this new environment, facing the same problems that they are. You ever been fired from a job? You notice how if you are, and you haven't quite been let go yet, but you've been told, you're not coming back, you become a leper. It might be catching, right? As you're walking down the hall, it might be catching. That's what's happening in that farm community. It's a scary thing. And so do you buy that land on auction? The land of your kin, the land of your friend? Do you buy whatever mechanical things they have? This is eating at the heart of these folks, and they're upset. These are tight communities, and their communities are being hurt, and they're very worried about this. So how they deal with this? Well, the first efforts out in the West and in the South were cooperative efforts. The Grange, the so-called patrons of husbandry. My wife, when she read about them, referred to them as Mason farmers. It's kind of odd. There's a secret society rolling around. You get the Knights of Columbus, Catholic Masons, as my mother used to call them. But they had all this secret handshakes and all the rest of it. But the whole deal of the patrons of husbandry was like other co-ops. They wanted to pool resources, share resources, try to share the best practice, help your neighbors, and have community centers. That was a real threat to the manufacturers of farm equipment. And they did everything they could to undermine the efforts of the Granges, which included selling at losses if the Grange wasn't purchasing and you were purchasing individually. They were more than happy to do that. In 1875, the Farmers' Alliances are created in both the North and the South. In the South, ranchers in Lampus, Texas, begin to act as a co-op to round up strays, hang horse thieves, as you would in Texas. Under Charles McCune, a son of a Methodist minister, they develop a political and cooperative organization by the 1880s, seeking alliances with the Farmers' Alliance in the North and also the Knights of Labor. Also as important was the foundation of the Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union, especially in Texas and North Carolina, where they were very viable political organizations at that time. Alliance members begin to contest local and state elections, figuring out, okay, the co-op thing isn't working as well as we thought. We got to get in there and change policy at the state level. And by 1892, as we see some momentum being gained here, the Populist Party bursts onto the scene, a full-fledged Southern-Western alliance challenging the Democrats, challenging the Republicans, challenging the Redeemers in the South. And it was all there. As Ben Tillman said to farmers in South Carolina, we need to raise less corn and more hell. And by golly, the farmers took them up on it. And so, again, we have an emergence, not an exact repeat of court versus country, but a rhyme. We certainly have a rhyme in this case, and it does occur. So what were their ideas? Well, I do think they're broadly Jeffersonian. Farming and labor were wealth-producing activities. Speculation is not. Speculators hate that when you tell them that, but it's true. I mean, speculation is not wealth-producing. And indeed, other activities, financing, credit, were held in suspicion, as Jeffersonians have always done so. And farming was a locus of virtue. Virtue, that idea, comes back out again, right? Tracing all back. We don't have elite fellows saying this necessarily, but it's the same idea rhyming again down through time. They're also a little bit Jacksonian to a degree. They have a fear of bank and financiers. Frankly, having worked in the industry, so should you, right? So should you. because of the use of their political power. They wanted to use political power to limit these people. They loved Jackson's last words, "I killed the bank," right? They loved that. Banks need killing. And indeed, all the national banks, they thought, were in definite need of killing. And here's the most important thing of all. The populists were nationalist in orientation. There was a realization that we can't go to war. It's a different world. We're dealing with a consolidated political order, and by golly gum, we're going to take it over. We're going to take that order over. And they're going to end up with proposals and policies that are going to strike one as very non-Jeffersonian to some degree. But it has to do with the fact that their view at this point is, and it's a very pragmatic one, we can't secede again. For one thing, the Westerners don't want to do it. We're not in a position to do it. Nobody's talking about that. We're talking about issues of justice. And if they're using the federal government as a stick to beat us, let's just go take over the federal government. We'll use the stick to beat them. And that's kind of how American politics play out today, as we see over and over and over. Let's take over that thing. Well, the Omaha platform lays out the populist program. Of course, it had interesting words attached to it. Moral wrongs, enslave. They're trying to enslave us. Another rhyme in the past. Injustice, plunder, and virtue were very important. These were the language and the concepts of the Country Party going back to the 1700s, of Jefferson, of John Taylor of Caroline, of Randolph. All these folks. They looked at themselves as comparable to the patriots of the Revolutionary era, to Jefferson and Jackson's people, to Calhoun and these folks. And there was a very strong religious overtone. One minister in the South said, "We populists have the morals of Christ and the politics of Thomas Jefferson." I wonder what Jefferson would have thought of that. But anyway. Well, I guess he would have been fine with the morals thing. I guess in his Bible is get all that supernatural stuff out of there. It makes me nervous. Policies. Remonetize silver and expand that money supply. There are a few fiat folks in there, too. There's a few old fans of the greenback whose attitude is, why just have a little inflation when you can have a lot? That's a very typical American idea, right? You know, the doctor gave me 4 pills to take. I asked him for 8, and I'll take them all at once. The graduated income tax. Let's redistribute some wealth. Because after all, and here is the argument, the wealth of the financier is ill-gotten. It needs to be cut back. Now, this is probably where some of the old-time Jeffersonians would have taken a step back and said, why don't we just get rid of taxes? But nevertheless. Government ownership of the railroad. This is where the Redeemers began to point their fingers and said, see, socialists. They've all gone socialist out in the Piedmont. Must be that Baptist Methodist thing going on or something. The telegraph and the telephone, they also wanted to be nationalized. A revenue tariff. They wanted to go back to a straight old-fashioned ad valorem, one duty for all goods revenue tariff. Direct election of senators. Their view was that the railroads had poisoned the well. So we might as well turn over the election of senators to the people and get it out of the hands of the General Assemblies. Recall, petition, and referendum. Can we get the scoundrels out? Is there a way that the people can come in and remove folks who are no longer working for the interests of the people? And one of my favorite, the revival of the Jeffersonian sub-treasury plan. Why can't the currency just be treasury notes issued by the treasury itself? Now, folks would all go, but that's like the Continentals. It'll be horrible. It'll be terrible. Remember, the Continental Congress couldn't tax. I would kind of like that. I wish I could issue Devanny notes, right? But I also wish I could tax you. Actually, this system worked very well in the early part of the Republic. If you look at the financing of the War of 1812, treasury notes that bore a modest interest rate kept their value throughout that war. And then after the war, how do you get rid of them? You give people a choice. Do you want to pay your taxes in gold, silver, or treasury notes? So you look at it, oh, you get the paper. And so you pull it back out. It's really not, if you're going to have a centralized monetary system, you can do a lot worse, like the Federal Reserve Bank, But in any event, there was a twist to their federal sub-treasury plan, and the twist was this. The federal sub-treasuries would also serve as storehouses for crops. And farmers could take loans up to 80% of the value of those crops. I thought that was really kind of curious, and it sort of did foreshadow, in a way, the federal government intervening in the agricultural markets today to buy surpluses and such. Government consolidation. Well, their view is, okay, we'll deal with the consolidation thing, but these are our policies. And let's be honest, some of these populists just took absolute delight in that they were making a lot of people very, very nervous about an income tax, about a federal subtreasury, and some of the rest of these things. But here is the thing that has changed. This is where the rhyme scheme breaks down. Yes, there's a Jacksonian heritage in place, but there's a realism that state sovereignty has been defeated definitively at Appomattox, as definitively as anything ever gets, right? The American Constitution was odd in this respect. It had a medieval twist to it. It was divided sovereignty. But after Appomattox, it's really hard to make the argument that you can do divided sovereignty outside the confines of Redeem or Home Rule. The other thing, too, why they go in this consolidation view, they believe the capital had taken over their state governments. The financiers, the railroads, and industry had inordinate influence in the policies of those people. And there was political naivete. We are nothing if not naive as Americans. It's part of our charm, I suppose, as the French would say, right? We are naive. They had confidence in government. Reminds me of the old classic, tongue-in-cheek, Animal House, right? The undergraduate lets the upperclassmen have the brother's car, and they, of course, wreck it. And one of them comes up to Flounder, who is the undergraduate, loaned them the car, and said, "Flounder, you screwed up. You trusted us." And too often, this is the Americans with their government. There was this confidence that if we had the right people into the government, we took it over, we could direct the policies. And the reason I say it's naive is this reason. Government's kind of interesting in the way that they function day to day. It's not just a question of good people in government. Is the process good? So there have been a lot of people who've gone up to D.C. and found out that, oh gosh, the way that we have to do business has been thoroughly twisted and depraved. But God bless them. I mean, we've all made this mistake, haven't we? Why do they fail ultimately? Why does the Populist Party fall apart? Well, obviously they have powerful enemies. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and Wall Street. You know, that's a tough triad to take on. Secondly, though, they themselves have tremendous divisions in their own ranks over policy and ideology. To give you a modern-day example, have you ever hung out at a Libertarian Party meeting? If you're bored one day, go to one. You will have the most inane, arcane arguments over policy. And I have sympathy with libertarians, I really do. The most arcane arguments over these ideological minutiae. And I'm thinking, my Lord, y'all should have been medieval theologians towards the end, you know. Keep the monk busy and write about arcane stuff. It's crazy. It is absolutely crazy. But that was what was going on in the Populist Party as well. Arguments, bitter arguments over silver, or do we do greenbacks, or whatever it may happen to have been at the time. Well, the story ends sadly in a number of ways, and I'll go ahead and begin the wrap-up here. In my view, it is the true last major revolt that we have seen from the country. We've seen some others, but this has been the last one. It won't be the last one. I'm a great believer in T.S. Eliot's view. There are no lost causes because no causes triumphed finally in this world, so keep the flame alive. It would be nice to see a few pitchforks in D.C. from time to time. But the populists do leave us some interesting legacies. I want to talk about that. They do have an influence on the progressives, because the progressives are screwed up too. I'm picking on the populists about their divisions and their arcane arguments. The progressives have the same thing. They're all over the map, especially on issues like immigration. They're falling in love with eugenics, some of them, and some of them are not, and all the rest of it. But the one thing that tied the progressives together was the fear of disorder. So you can imagine how they viewed the populists. There's some disorder, and it's those country people with guns that are having the disorder. We can't have that. And so what the progressives do is they figure out a very important political technique. Let's take some of these populist ideas and adopt them. So both Democrats and Republicans begin to adopt things like a slow reduction in tariffs over time. Not huge, but slow. They adopt recall, petition, and referendum. They adopt eventually a graduated income tax. They move in this direction because they understand that if we do this, the last person who did this very well was Bill Clinton. Oh, you thought I raised your taxes too high. Well, so did I. And boom, off he goes. I remember when he was told that he had to pay attention to the bond market, that the bond market was the great signaler of the economy. Jimmy Carville was pitching 40 fits. The bond market? What do you mean the bond market? And Clinton's like, I'm okay with that. We'll do what we have to do. That's a very progressive attitude, that we'll go ahead and adopt some of your ideas and we will diffuse some of that anger in this case. And so populists were ultimately absorbed predominantly in the Democratic Party over time as a result of this. The other interesting thing of the legacy is they continue to illustrate the problem of the consolidation of financial power and its marriage to political power. This is a problem. And by the way, this has very little to do with free markets. I love how capitalists will tell you, yes, we grew up in a free market. No, you didn't. I've read the literature, man. The first thing you did is rent salt, right? You went to the king and said, by the way, I would like to have a very different tax structure. I want warehouses. I want roads. And I'll pay you some money for your Swiss mercenaries. Well, Jacques Coué, we have a deal, right? No other merchant's able to make that deal. So it's a matter of risk. And what I think the populists show us is that industry at the time was seeking as much government protection through the tariff regime, government contracts and subsidies to insulate the risk. The bigger you get as a business, and many of you are business people, the more risk you undertake. And isn't it really cool if you can use the federal government, who gets to tax their creditors? That's just wonderful, right? As a way to protect and insulate you from risk. They were aware of that damage. But they also tell us the problem of regulatory capture. The progressives say, we'll go one better, populists. We'll have these agencies that will watch over the American economy and its aspects, and they will make sure things are safe and that they are fair. Do this for me one time. Go and look and see who has been the Secretary of Treasury the last, 8 administrations and which banks they're coming from. Or perhaps the Department of Agriculture. You might want to take a look at the corporations that those folks were working for. It's a revolving door. Large corporations ultimately capture the agencies that are supposed to be regulating the corporation that they came from and that they often go back to. If we really believed in free markets, we wouldn't have just let Lehman fall on their sword. Goldman and JP should have gone down, and BB&T and other good banks should have been allowed to buy their assets. But we cannot have that. No. That would have led to carnage and the fall of Rome, and the Visigoths are among us. Yeah, or whatever. Sorry, I'm kind of cynical about these things. But here's some not so good things as well. The industrialization of farming practices. This happens much more slowly. And again, I don't want to leave you with an image of, today I'm a populist, now it's 1900 and I'm on my John Deere going down the field. No. But what does emerge is that farming practices do industrialize over time, and it is correlated to oil. Good old Earl. Earl doesn't just give you the fuel for the John Deere, it gives you the fertilizer too. It's used in the processes today for the genetic manufacturing of crops. Modern agriculture is not possible without Earl. And by this, I mean oil, and a nod to my Louisiana friends, as down the bayous will often pronounce oil, Earl. This industrialization of farming practices is going to force more and more farmers out. Farmer does not exist as a category anymore in the U.S. Census because there's fewer than 2 million. There are many family farms, and many of them are organized as corporations. Row cropping, you now have crop insurance, things of this nature. And I'm not beating up on farmers here. I'm not sure what choices they had going forward. But the reality is they enter into this world. Think of the tariff thing, right? The Japanese like, we're not buying your soybeans anymore. And the farmer's like, what do we do? That's all we grow. We don't diversify. Or next year is the corn rotation. So you have this kind of industrial level farming with industrial practices, buying a futures contract, securing crop insurance. Farmers end up fully integrating into that modern finance and industrial system. And by the way, yes, AI will be in the farm field in the not too distant future. they're now figuring out. They've got the stuff that can pick the crops, plant the crops, give the crops moisture. They just have to figure out how do we make sure the components can deal with the conditions outdoors under the sun and with the dust and the moisture. Once they got that figured out, robot farms, here we come. Next up, a really curious thing begins to emerge in the South, and this plays into the agrarian identity. The country party is obviously, in quotations, country party, deeply weakened by the failure of the populace. But now the farmer as country cousin of the urban southerner becomes an interesting motif. Southerners know that traditionally we are an agrarian people. And if you decide to go to town and you hung out your shingles, a doctor, a lawyer, a store owner, whatever it may be, or you were working in the cotton mills and what have you, you had a cousin out in the country. And you visited the cousin on their farm, you sent the kids out there, and they got to get a little taste of farm life as well. They got to breathe some fresh air. And it became very important for Southerners to have the country cousin. That still grounded them in the idea that we have some connection to the land, even if I am in a mill town having to buy my stuff from the mill store. I do have a country cousin out there. I don't know what's going to happen with that in the future. There's fewer and fewer country cousins and fewer young Southerners who care if they have them. But for a very long time through the 20th century, that was important. Southerners, even with the defeat of the Populist Party, were loath to let go of some connection, particularly a blood kin connection to the land. My mother, as a child, for instance, was always shunted out west to Carroll County to go visit and spend weeks on the farm of her Wilt relatives in that time, which was kind of interesting. So as late as after World War II, shunting out to visit the country cousins was a common thing. But here's the most interesting thing of all, because I don't think this thing goes away. Among the elites, the financial elites, the Hollywood elites, the movers and shakers in D.C., K Street with the lobbyists, these people fear the common man. They fear, Johnny Irish up in South Boston, but they really fear the rural common person. And populism exposes that fear. And so here's some front porch tobacco spit and speculation on that fear, which means I don't have a lick of evidence to support this. My own view on why that fear is in place goes back to the old idea of rural self-sufficiency. Y'all remember Hank Williams Jr.'s song, Country Boy Can Survive. Probably a little bit more true when it came out than today. I'm looking at some country boys and I'm thinking, hey, you got type 2 diabetes coming down the road, son. You might want to lay off the Mountain Dew. But nevertheless, at one time, this was the case. This was the case. And it's not just that they think that country people are violent. Country people are deeply religious. You recall Mr. Obama about Alabama, and he was referring to Pennsylvania, but he was referring to the Alabama part of Pennsylvania, right, between the two cities, where he said they just clutch at their guns and their Bibles. The fear in there is that, A, these people have religion to some degree still, and that makes them upset. It shouldn't, right? They should be feeling snobbish about all that, right? But it makes them fearful. Secondly, the idea that these people still have a knowledge that is not there for me. It's kind of interesting how prepping for the apocalypse has taken off as a business lately, isn't it, right? And by the way, the elite are prepping. I mean, they're big time prepping. They got these little caves in the Rocky Mountain thing going on and all kinds of craziness. I often wonder about, if you recall, there is I believe it's Revelations, where when our Lord comes back, the people say, let the mountains fall upon us. I wonder if that means the elite, right? There would be like a landslide that locks them into their little bunkers and such. But there is this view among these people that there are skills, running the trot line, farming, hunting, doing without, or as my mother and father used to say, making do, that these people are afraid of, that there's a certain knowledge and experience that they don't have. And if this thing runs out, they're going to be at the mercy of their country cousins 40 times removed. I don't know. As I said, I don't have a lick of evidence for that. It'd be kind of interesting if one of the better polling organizations would come out with a questionnaire, exactly why are you afraid and hate country people, and see what comes up with all that. But in any event, I do think that to this day, in the populist movement, because they are invoked, you turn on talk radio to this day, they are invoked. Well, Trump is a populist and he is getting all those crazy Midwesterners and Southerners upset. And they voted for him. And they're deplorable. You can't say that. They won't vote for us. Well, I mean, they're very terribly confused and vexed over this. But the term populist gets thrown out there, sometimes in very positive overtones on talk radio, that this is a good thing, that the people are finally saying, enough, you've mismanaged the situation. So they're still with us. The populists may have suffered a terrible political defeat, but that legacy is still with us today, it seems to me. And I don't think it's going to go away. Because for me, the dominant theme is not silly Marxist, proletariat and labor or the oppressed. It's country versus court. And the desire among some Americans to be part of that court no matter what it takes, and to live the high life, and the desire of the country to be left alone to pursue its own version of happiness. And that, in my view, is what the populists have left us with, at least at this point in time. Thank you so much for your attention.